building age and land improvement ratios, lot size, and a number of other factors, and then looked at the probability of any given sort of lot in the city redeveloping and scoring those. And when you look at it, especially from, further away, you see the areas that are red have higher likelihood of development than the bluer areas, for example. So when you look at it that way, it really helps have a conversation of if you're going to see redevelopment in those areas, is the infrastructure at a place that can accommodate those developments? The ones that are the more blue in tone are ones you're not likely to see a whole heck of a lot of change right away. And this map would change over time as well. This is a current picture, but if you were to even just look at building age alone, you're going to see more red in the existing developed areas over time. In terms of the likelihood of redevelopment, we have another map here that's basically looking at the crossroads between daily needs and the likelihood of redevelopment, and can help the staff and council make decisions on where you should potentially direct development. If you want the community to be complete and have high access to daily needs, then you're going to want to locate them in the areas with high access to daily needs and the likelihood of redevelopment. And you'll see that the area that's probably the most purple, if you will, is also very close to downtown and a lot of your growth centers. Which is a really good situation to have. And the west side of Courtenay is a much higher concentration of land, being an older part of the community that's likely to be redeveloped. Do we have any questions at this time before I go on?
It looks like we might. Councillor Hillian.
Thanks very much, Mayor, and thanks so far. Do any of the projections consider boundary extensions?
Through the chair, what we were trying to do is determine if the 20 years of housing need could be accommodated within the existing boundary, which based on our analysis, that looks very possible to do so without boundary extensions. But that's, of course, another option for the city. But under the auspices of complete communities and keeping everything compact and not sprawling, our focus was sort of away from that option for now.
Thanks, Councillor Hillian. And Councillor McCollum.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, just going back to the map that you had up just before you asked about questions. There's a fair amount of gray area in the floodplain and along the seashore. And I just want to confirm that we've graded that out based on our flood management plan. Or, I mean, that's one of the metrics that's been laid in to what we're seeing in that map. Is that right?
Yeah, through the chair, in our methodology, we did remove those areas and sensitive ecosystem areas, for example, from the analysis.
Okay, that's great. That makes good sense to me. I had one other question. It's just related to the gray area that's south of the growth center that is made up of the top of Ryan Road. It's also grayed out there, and I understand that, I mean, that's been recently cleared and is under development. So I'm just wondering why that's considered a gray zone. Is that was that just not?
Through the
no, not, yeah, there, that's right. Yeah, just south of that. Actually, I guess that's west of that red line there. I'm just wondering why that's grayed out, because I would have thought we were doing development there.
Is that 1900 Ryan Road? I have to check. Yeah, I can't really see it on this. Do you know that one?
Ms. Wade.
Yeah, through the chair to Councillor McComb. Yeah, there is the area that you're talking about has a development application in and has been cleared for phase 1 of that development. I think that's the one you're talking about, and it's referred to as 1900 Ryan Road.
So is there a reason why it's considered gray in the map?
I'll answer that. with this, the idea was like, where's future redevelopment going to be? And because this is an existing development, which is vacant land that is currently going to be developed, the chances of it being redeveloped because it's actually just being constructed now is less.
Okay, that makes sense. I see.
I hope that
Even though we
clarifies.
don't have the housing up, it is kind of in the pipeline, so we're not looking at, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum, and thanks for the clarity. And Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor, and thanks for this report. These maps are just absolutely fascinating. And on this map, I find it interesting to see the what's it called, the potential growth center expansion, and it certainly makes sense, that kind of dotted yellow line. And looking at it, there's also sort of, to my eye, comparable amounts of purple between sort of McPhee and Lake Trail. That's sort of I'm just wondering, what were the thoughts around that particular yellow marked out growth expansion area? And are there any others or that you see as likely candidates, including the area I was just talking about?
Let me put your mic back on there. So, and I'll just turn it on for you, and you don't have to turn it off. You can just leave it on, and then that way. Exactly. There you go.
Okay, thank you. And through the chair, yeah, thank you for raising that point. So the area that's circled in yellow that I wish was a little more highly visible than it is an area that we identified based on this analysis that's sort of south of downtown, if you will, that was outside of the Cliff Avenue and the downtown growth centers that has high likelihood of redevelopment, aging and depreciating buildings while being very close to daily needs. And so it might be an area when you're looking at the OCP of potentially expanding that growth area, looking very closely at the zoning in that area to have that much needed density. And then we'll also add to the vibrancy of downtown.
Excellent. Thanks, Councillor Cole Hamilton. And it looks like that answered most of the questions. Thanks so much.
So in terms of where growth is occurring, this is essentially just an overlay of the development applications over top of the municipal area. And you can see that a lot of the growth is occurring within your growth centers, which is, I think, a really great sign, and just kind of wanted to highlight that. So in terms of encouraging growth in those areas and then looking at what's actually happening on the ground, there is alignment there. When we look at housing, in terms of we felt that the boundary using our analysis could support the 20 years of housing need, which I think is probably somewhat of a relief. A significant amount of that 20 years of growth can also be accommodated through SHMU housing units. In terms of the makeup of properties in Courtenay, there's quite a lot of highly likelihood to develop SHMU properties as well, where some communities aren't going to necessarily see that uptake as SHMU as strongly, because you have a lot of sort of depreciated or aging houses on the west side. You've also got a lot of larger lots and interest in development in the community. So I think you have a good recipe to see a fairly significant SHMU uptake. So we have that in the pie chart before you. It's sort of indicating that about 48% of your growth could be accommodated as infill SHMU, and a very significant also in the growth centers. We do anticipate sort of the single detached housing form continuing on in the future, but it will be a much smaller component than what you've seen in the past. There's a number of key findings that are outlined in the report, and then many of these key findings also have recommendations within the final sections of the report, implementation recommendations. So, we don't need to go over all of them. You do have the report in front of you, and I know we have a limited time. But I think that when you're looking at the questions regarding do we have enough opportunity to develop within our existing boundary, we feel that looking at the likelihood of redevelopment, 60% of the land that's likely to redevelopment would need to redevelopment to fulfill the housing needs. So even if, you still have a 40% slack rate, if you want to look at it that way. And then the downtown is an area where you do have some infrastructure issues, but you also have projects underway that are going to rectify some of those, and additional projects could be prioritized. And there's a significant amount of development and density that could be provided around the downtown, which would also add to viability. Employment uses are something that should also be considered regarding when you get to your OCP and like where those employment lands are going to be. A lot of employment lands have been identified for South Courtney, and there is like quite some significant infrastructure upgrades required in the south. So that's something to consider as well as you update your master plans in OCP. Moving into infrastructure, and there's obviously a strong relationship between housing and infrastructure. We spent quite a bit of time working with staff on sort of assessing what the existing conditions of infrastructure is, as it's a really good segue that led into our development cost charge work in determining the projects and also helping prioritize those projects as part of the DCC project. These maps are included in the report, but they also come with tables that identify some specific projects that need to get done to sort of turn areas from red to green, if you will. It's like a stoplight map. These are based on sort of existing conditions of the infrastructure. If you were to plan out and update all your master plans, you would be wanting to identify how to translate these from red to green. But these are also based on existing uses, existing capacity. So one thing I just wanted to note is if you're to look at Sandwick, it's green. And it's like, oh, let's direct growth to Sandwick. There's really good infrastructure up there. There's no problems. That's not what it's saying, is it's fine for the existing uses that are there. It's not necessarily saying that it's great if you were to increase the density in those areas. And you'll see the hash marks too around the downtown, which is sort of currently red, but there's projects underway that will turn that to green. So please use these maps with caution. But they were very valuable in terms of the conversations that we had with staff. And what we want to do is, recognize that the game has changed in terms of the zoning provisions and negotiating with developers. So what we really need to make sure is that we're planning for our infrastructure like we never have before, because we don't have the powers of zoning to negotiate those upgrades. So these maps are based on existing capacity, but they're certainly highlighting the need to upgrade infrastructure in the city, and that there will be a need to prioritize it in order for it to be affordable for the city. Okay. I'm not advancing. Or do I need to?
Is it not working now?
Okay.
And we did have a question from Councillor Jolicoeur, but we're going to wait until the next stop if that's preferred.
Okay, thank you. All right. So there is a project underway as well to be upgrading the city's infrastructure modeling. And with this new legislation and pre-zoning, I just can't emphasize how important that is, so that you can anticipate the impacts of the density where you're likely to see it. And then those will have to be prioritized where growth is desired to occur first. The next slide is the water infrastructure readiness. So not quite as dire as the sewer infrastructure, but there's still some areas that do need some attention. It's quite positive in the downtown and Cliff Avenue corridors being in pretty good shape. But in terms of also stormwater management as well as being identified in the report, and there's a real push to sort of green infrastructure with stormwater management, and also managing post-development flows to meet pre-development flows and reducing increased runoff. So the other item that we discussed with staff that came up is like, it's not just about building new infrastructure, but sometimes you can gain capacity by having, water metering, efficiency and reducing consumption, but also like fixing the system inefficiencies such as leakage and inflow and infiltration. So those are also opportunities to improve infrastructure or utilize what you have more efficiently. Before I go into the daily needs aspect, does anyone have any questions at this time?
And Councillor Gilles, did you still have a question?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the report. Just echoing my colleagues' comments around my appreciation for all the detail and a lot to digest. In the report, it highlights in a few slides previously, you spoke about the OCP land use designations and development applications. I think it's on page on page 42, figure 13, which highlights all the little dots. I think there's green, yellow, dark green, and red. And there's a fair bit across the city. And so I just wanted some clarification. Those are all in stream because the next two pages after that is water infrastructure and proposed development and sanitary infrastructure and proposed development. And the dots don't actually align. So in the original page 42, figure 13, there's a lot more applications that are visible than on the water infrastructure page and the sanitary sewer infrastructure page. So just wanted some clarity around that.
So the smaller dots on the figure are upcoming applications and the larger dots are in stream. So I'm expecting that one of those figures doesn't have the upcoming applications and only the in stream.
So the water and the sewer are only in stream.
That's right.
Okay, that's helpful. And as a follow-up to that, I think somewhere in the report, I believe maybe it's in the staff report, it speaks to, or maybe it's in our next item, but it speaks to what would happen to in-stream applications and if this moves forward. And so I guess just because I was pleasantly surprised to see the amount of dots in figure 13, page 42. And so I was just kind of curious to understand where those would fit if this were to proceed. Again, more specifically, I guess, the smaller dots, because I think it's quite clear that the larger dots will continue under previous policies, but maybe it could also get clarity on that as well.
Through the chair. Yeah, you saw that in the next presentation regarding legislation around in-stream application protection for development cost charges.
Okay.
So essentially when you have a precursor application or a building permit that was issued prior to the adoption of the bylaw, those applications would have a 12-month protection essentially to pay the new DCC rate. And we can get into that more in the next presentation.
Okay. And I do have one more set of questions, Mayor, but I can't see who else is in the room, so.
At this point, we do have Councillor Hillian's light on. Rest of council is here, but he's the only other one. And Councillor Hillian has ceded the floor if you'd like to continue.
Great, thanks, Councillor Hillian. Yeah, my next question was related to the sanitary component of the report. Quite illuminating around, I think, some of the challenges that we're experiencing, in particular in the south part of Courtenay. I'm wondering, there is some detail in the report around, I think, the Puntledge neighborhood, West Courtenay, downtown, and kind of the Cliff Ave growth area or urban corridor. And so just so that I understand this correctly, so the impacts, the challenges in South Courtenay, which are is the darker red on the image that we're seeing here, those are not necessarily caused by localized issues of development, but my understanding from the report, and I just want clarity on this, is that those other areas of the community, Puntledge downtown, urban corridor, Cliff Ave area, actually feed into the issues that are happening in sanitary system in South Courtenay. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure if staff would like to answer that question in terms of the details, but I think there's a combination there in the sanitary system that's incorporating the regional district. Needs to upgrade the South Courtney system, plus compiled with some localized infrastructure projects that need upgrading. Yeah. Defer to staff.
Okay, Mr. Davidson.
Yes, so the question directly, it was, are all of these sanitary issues compounding through one singular area? Some of them, yes, but not all of them. The South Courtney area generally flows north to about 20th Street and then goes under the river through some siphons. So areas downstream of there heading north are compounded as the flow continues. Puntledge area, you'll see shaded out in brown there. Largely restricted due to capacity limitations in the First Street lift station, which is currently being rebuilt this year. So fingers crossed that should go well and that should be largely resolved. Some of the other areas are just generally due to loading overall in an age system. So those will require remediation, upgrade capacity increase as density increases. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Davidson. And I'll maybe just get the podium back up here. And that's all good, or do you nothing further to add?
Nothing further to add.
Excellent. Okay, so Councillor Jolker, we'll move on to Councillor Helene. Thanks for your questions.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm not sure where this comes in the discussion, but I'm just wondering if staff or our consultants have any sense of what the people of the community are thinking and expecting in relation to these issues. We've already had a fair amount of, I'd say, reaction to the number of new apartment buildings, the increased density, particularly in places like the Ryan corridor, the Superstore area. We had a development approved last week that where we had a response from a community basically reacting to change. The numbers that we are projecting here with the additional population growth over what we had expected, and there's an indication that the most significant need will be for studio and one-bedroom apartments, suggesting single people or maybe working couples, I don't know, but it sounds like it's going to be a very significant change in terms of the single-family dwellings that have been the typical living accommodation for most of the people, for a lot of the people for a lot of years. So I'm just wondering where we see our community in regards to this reality and to what extent we're going to need to do a major re-education process to help people to come to terms with this.
Ms. Wade.
Through the mayor to Councillor Hillian, thanks for the question. As part of what we engage upon for the update to the OCP, we will be having to do an information about how we have to meet under the provincial legislation our targets for housing and growth in a 20-year cycle. And what does that mean with the change in housing type? Courtney actually is quite far ahead. Most communities are like 75, 80% single family or single residential dwellings. And then I'm predominantly very low on multifamily. We're actually got a large percentage of our housing type is multifamily. And what we're seeing now is the trends in changing in the composition of those dwelling units based on just a variety of things that we've identified in the housing needs assessment. So that information piece will very much be part of the community engagement strategy that we'll be doing as part of the OCP, because you can see what is happening as we do this complete communities assessment and the change in the population growth. Because as we've noted that it's hugely more, we're increasing our population way faster than we thought we were when we did the 2022 OCP. So it is definitely a messaging and a communication piece that we will be incorporating into our engagement process with this.
Thanks. Any subsequent?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. The other thing I was curious about, why were we so wrong in that? It seems a really significant error. I mean, I know that the pandemic changed everything in terms of people flocking here from the bigger cities. Is that what we're seeing, or are there other factors that you've identified?
Through the mayor to Council Healing, part of it was just what statistics were available at the time when the analysis was done. The 2021 stats became available after the OCP was adopted. So that's one piece. And just some of the analyticals that have, I guess there's greater diversity in the analytical tools that we've used within the housing needs assessment. So we have a better understanding of those compositions and the growth. And Courtney did see a huge population shift from 2014 to 2024 that really has impacted the growth even greater. So there's about 3 different components that are impacting the 43% increase that we're projecting for 2041.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Councillor Hilly. And yeah, I'm talking to communities across the province and even the nation. The population stuff from Stats Canada really has varied widely, and it's been a big challenge. And as we look at some of the major economic things, one of our biggest engines right now is CFB Comox, and they have a lot of big projects coming on in the next 10 years as well. That's going to drive a lot of growth. So yeah. It's a lot happening. Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, just picking up on the topic of growth projections. Yeah, when we did the OCP, I mean, it seemed like we were maybe erring a little bit on the conservative side for population growth. And I think that came up at the time because we could kind of see that things were maybe moving along a bit quicker at the time. But, you always have to look retroactively to project. So, but I guess my question around that is, what if our current projections are off also wrong in that, the last 5 years that we've experienced is actually a blip, and that will maybe go back to kind of more typical, the typical growth that we've experienced around population. And just, how often do we look at this? We've got like a straight line projection over 20 years. And of course, like growth never really goes in a straight line. So I guess my question is, how often are we going to reevaluate that? And then what impacts would that have on the way we implement the plan if, we look at it and realize that it is actually trending a little slower, in the next 5 years than we just experienced in the previous 5 years?
Through the chair, part of the new legislation that it has set up is like mandating a cycle take place, and that sort of 5 years with the housing needs report needs to be updated, and then the OCP needs to be updated every 5 years. It's best practice that your master plans, your infrastructure master plans are also within that cycle, so they're feeding each other. And then if the growth isn't occurring as rapidly as you can also everything can be adjusted accordingly. Because the 5 or the 20-year growth projections will also roll on that 5-year cycle, you can tone them down if that growth isn't occurring. Although this valley is extremely attractive, and it has become very well known, much more than it was when I lived here 15 years ago and moved back, and it's changed a lot. And just sort of having that gone away and come back feeling there's definitely a lot of interest in moving here, and you're starting to really feel that. Will that be sustained? We don't know, and that's why it's best practice to be updating these and your development cost charges on a 5-year cycle, and development cost charges even more frequently.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I can see why our master plans would be an important piece of that too. And of course, all this always comes down to capacity, that there's like so many moving parts, and having the resources to, you know, keep our plans up to date is a challenge. And I don't know how smaller municipalities manage, to be honest, but yeah, thanks for that answer.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. And yeah, I mean, you know, we also get impacted by world events and even a lot of federal policies and immigration policy in particular, as that could wildly change and seems to as well. So thanks for the question, Councillor Morin.
Great, thanks, Mayor. Lots of chat about growth. And I guess, you know, many people will say we should be somehow closing the borders to our community, which of course we can't do. But the housing needs assessment obviously identifies the type of housing based on probably things like people who are going to deliver the services to people, more so than maybe people who want to come here for other reasons, because it's a great place to live and they want to retire here, because we need to have the workforce to be able to deliver the services. And that's probably why we're seeing the trend to the smaller units, I would think. So I guess my question is around, do we have a mechanism for analytics around why people are, you know, who's coming here and why? Because it sounds harsh, but we kind of want to set up things so that we have the people that we need to deliver the services here, whatever that looks like. And not to say that we can shut doors, but I think we need to be able to address that. And of course, that is what we're trying to do through the housing needs assessment. So is there some kind of analytics that kind of describe that? So that we can't really prioritize who's coming here, but in a way we can.
Through the chair, I mean, I think there's both qualitative and quantitative analytics. I mean, in terms of the BC stats and the census and all of it, there's so much more to that, that statistical analysis that can illuminate those types of questions in terms of who's coming, what employment sector are they in, what age group are they in, that you can help project. And then obviously income and affordability too. I'm sure if you ask anyone, I learned the hard way on a survey about 30 years ago, asking people what type of accommodation would you like to live in, you know, single family, townhouse, and apartment, and the answer was 99% single family. But that's wasn't the reality then, and it's not the reality now. So it's also not just what people want, but what they can afford. And so that is something that can be analyzed. But when you're doing your OCP and the engagement, you can also be doing surveys and asking those questions, you know, how long have you lived here? What brought you to the valley? You know, that type of thing. You know, certainly hearing about a lot of younger people moving to the valley because it just isn't affordable for them anymore in Victoria or Vancouver. And quite often they might be people who left and they're coming back, but also many new people that didn't grow up here. So I think there's both, like that qualitative piece is also really important.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Morin. And Councillor Frisch.
Thanks, Mayor. I wonder if you have any insight into other communities on the island and what their growth rates are like. And I guess I ask that because I wonder, is it possible that we're just balancing growth with quality of life so well that people are choosing to come here? Or is it in fact, it's just a trend of people wanting to come to the island in general?
Through the chair, I mean, Courtney's growth rate is high comparatively to many other communities that we're working in on the island. But I think in general, Vancouver Island is a popular place to move to. And we also seem to be having a lot of growth in some of our communities and young, like children and families. It's not just retirement. So it's probably more a different picture than maybe 20 years ago or so. So, but this area is some of the highest projected growth rates that we are working in for sure.
Yeah, I've lived in lots of places where development was done through sprawl, and I know personally it became very uncomfortable to live there. I wonder if that's, you know, we were one of the first people to say we're not going to do that. So unfortunately, now everyone wants to come here. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Frisch. And actually the Comox Valley Chamber of Commerce in their economic forecast that they do, they've done good analytics on the island. So there's a report through the Chamber's website. I bet you exactly how we compare to other locations on Vancouver Island and that cumulative effect that's coming down. It was a massive number. So, all right, thanks.
Shall I continue then?
Absolutely.
Thank you. We're almost through this, and I know we have another significant presentation. You'll see from the report that, most of the focus was around housing and infrastructure, although we did do a daily needs analysis that was done to some extent during the OCP. This methodology is slightly different, and it's essentially showing, the walking distance in 5, 10, 15-minute walk or 400, 800, 1200 meter walks to a variety of compiled facilities. So these are the access to daily needs are identified on the screen, and then the results are in this map. But I think what is also important just for staff and council to realize is this as a tool. We can peel out every single layer of those daily needs. If you're interested in, where are all the daycares or where are all the grocery stores and what's the distance to each of those. I find that quite intriguing if you're looking at making land use changes. This was using fairly big data sets, so it would be something that if you're going to do that, because we're looking at a cumulative score, that you just do some ground truthing. And I think, making sure that all the daycares are up to date and so on. And things like pharmacies are identified because quite often if the pharmacy is in Walmart, it's not necessarily identified as a pharmacy, which is okay when we're looking at that cumulative score. But if you're to look at layers, you might need to do a little bit more work with the data, but a really interesting tool. And same with parks. How far is a playground from the house? If the community's goal is to have a playground within 400 meters of every resident, you could map it and you can see where you need to start looking at pocket parks in the future, for example. So some of the key findings is, that this side of the Puntledge has higher access to daily needs. It also feels way more like transit oriented, pedestrian oriented, even though there's some really strong daily needs up at Ryan and Lerwick, for example. It doesn't have that same pedestrian feel. So something to think about as moving forward in planning, cycling and pedestrian infrastructure. Generally, there's pretty good access to parks and sports facilities, but changes from type depending on where you are in the community. And one thing we also picked up is that walkshed to Vanier High School. There's some areas that aren't super great for cycling to and walking to, and that could be one area that you might want to look for improvement and potential partnerships to improve that active transportation access to the school is one example. Evaluating the transportation, we were focusing on transit, bikeway, cycling, walking, pedestrian. Basically, we weren't running a transportation model on vehicles. That wasn't the focus, with the focus on sort of reducing greenhouse gases and enhancing public health. And like Courtney, many cities, and I know you did this through the SHMU zoning analysis, but also are reducing the parking so that one, it's more affordable to develop, but two, kind of forcing people to get on their bike or into transit or walking to their daily needs. Some of the other items that we identified is, some of those sort of secondary growth centers do have some gaps in the active transportation network. So things that you might want to look at as you're planning and undertaking transportation master plans, and even to the DCC program as well, in terms of like how could some of those be funded through that program, which is something that was underway with staff. There's also the 3 transit exchanges stations that are in process. So those will also potentially significantly impact the transportation planning moving forward and increasing ridership as people move away from utilizing their cars. So before handing back to Marianne about how to make all of these recommendations happen, does anyone have any final questions for me before I hand it off? I'm happy to jump back up if need be too.
Councillor Helene.
Thanks, Mayor. You sounded fairly convinced that people will move away from their cars. Where does that faith come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people will love their cars, but can we walk instead of drive? And for our office is on the other side of the river. I walk downtown for lunch every time, hands down, even if it's raining. And part of that's also because of just the traffic flow is also like, it's faster to walk, right? So, I mean, some communities are like, well, let's let transportation fail a bit, and then people will look to other modes of transportation. The city of Vancouver, obviously a much bigger example, but you know, it's so difficult to drive for many and so expensive, and it is the second biggest household expense. So if you're not going to give up the housing, you might have to give up some transportation choice. So hopefully we can do that as a community where maybe we're moving down to 1-car families instead of 2-car families and choosing our trips. But I know it's a very difficult one, and it is still quite easy to drive in this area. So we're not saying eradicate the car, but maybe make different choices and make it, the easier you make that for people, then we'll start seeing that shift.
Yeah, I'm hearing again concerns about parking and congestion, and you know, I think we've been telling people that as the community grows, it's inevitable that it's going to get busier. The streets are going to get busier, and but I don't think people are too keen on the suggestion that the solution is to park your car. So anyway, yeah, interesting to see how that unfolds. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Halian. And I know there's some people that are excited about car sharing technologies, but they're probably a ways off. But, Evan, Councillor Jolicoeur.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, going back to the likelihood of development, and I guess all the mapping, spoke to the LAP, the local area development for Ryan and Anderton. I think in the report, it speaks to language like careful consideration for a local area plan development for that area. Can you speak to that in more detail, please?
Yes, through the chair. That's something that is identified in your official community plan, sort of as a future secondary growth center. And our concern is it looks like without focusing in on that area, you can meet your 20-year housing needs, and that perhaps like it might be a better investment to focus on the daily needs centers that you already have versus like building that one up, because it looks a little bit like it could be sprawl. But if there's a point in time where Courtenay starts growing that way and you look at boundary extension and that becomes a really important housing node for the community, then of course we want you to include daily needs in that area to service that population. But for right now, it doesn't seem like something that you really need to make a priority.
Great. Okay. And as a follow-up for another local area plan, I see on most of the mapping, and I believe that you indicated in the report that you've excluded floodplain and parks. But in South Courtenay, there's plan work to be done on the Air Park local area plan. And so just wondering, and this might, again, more so be for staff, but just wondering, yeah, if we can get some clarification on that exclusion.
Through the chair, I mean, in terms of the air park, we're looking at its current use. We have heard that staff is looking at a local area plan for that, but that wasn't something that was factored into our review as like a change of use at this time.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Councillor Jolicoeur. And Ms. Wade.
Through the mayor to Councillor Jolicoeur, I just had a clarification too, is that we're aware that that is a council's strategic priority, and we need to look at that. And so that's why it's in the financial plan. But we also have to pull together the timing of that in relation to capacity within the Development Services Department, and also understanding, you know, we'll scope that out in 2025, and that will also help to inform the update to the OCP. So that it'll be utilized to inform the update for the OCP.
Thanks for that. And I don't see any further questions. So, all right, thank you.
Well, as you can see, we have a lot to make happen. And this graph is showing you how we're all interrelated. And, you know, we have the strategic plan, council strategic priorities that inform our 5-year financial plan. And we have the OCP, which is at the center of guiding us to how we are going to update our zoning bylaw. And there's also the provincial legislation, which has hugely changed over this last year. And I'm anticipating there might be more changes ahead of us. So that is greatly impacting what our OCP looks like in our zoning bylaw. One of the key things from this assessment tool is the relationship between the OCP and the master plans and the financial plan. And what the assessment has is utilize the master plans with the data that is associated with the age of that master plan. And so one of the things we've identified is the need to update those master plans, put in the current growth projections so that we really understand where the constraints are in our land use so that we can identify where a little more accurately than what you're seeing today, where we can actually strategically place growth in a sequential manner. And so that has an impact on the capital projects and when they come and the timing of it. So the master plans are really critical as we move forward this next year in understanding and identifying capacity modeling within there and understanding constraints so that we can inform the financial plan moving forward. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then the other master plans and policies are things like the subdivision servicing bylaw, for example. So the specifications we'd be looking at would be taking in a lot of these components as we move forward to address things like how do we efficiently use water better and stormwater management and things like that. So there's a lot of moving pieces as we move through making this happen. It's not moving forward. Okay. And so the implementation tools in the assessment report, we've organized them by understanding what the implementation tool is. So you'll see in the spreadsheets that there's actually organized by what is the bylaw or tool that we have legislatively that will help us to implement those actions. And understanding also who's all involved, what lenses that it's hitting from the assessment tool, and then also identifying where we can best our funding sources. So some of them will have been noted that they're in the financial plan. Some of them will say that we're looking for some grant money, some of it's staff time. So we've tried to high level sort out how does this affect the departments as well as our funding sources. And here's an example of that. I didn't think that we can go through them if you have any questions, but this is the idea and the layout. This helps to inform these complex decisions and be proactive in our planning and integrate this into our financial planning, our work planning, and understanding where the need is to place development as quickly as we can as well to meet our housing needs target that we've been mandated to meet as well. So what is our next step on the complete communities assessment? We submit the final report to UBCM as the completion of our grant. And then we take this information and become proactive planning and have a framework that will help us to coordinate all the plans that we need to do, that will help us implement the tools we need to do to meet our 20-year growth projections and increase a more complete understanding of our city and growth, and introducing ways to measure, monitor, and every 5 years come back and look at this so that we can do things in a very comprehensive, coordinated manner. And that's it. And we can ask any questions that you may have of us.
Excellent. And it looks like Councillor Jolicoeur, you can go right now if you'd like.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, we've got lots of comments, but I'm still on some clarification questions on the recommendations section, and quite a lot of actions. And so I appreciate that you've kind of explicitly mentioned that you've done some initial assessments around departments that will be involved to actually see those actions through and identify potential funding sources. one that I think was generally quickly mentioned in the report, but I know in conversations with the development community, it's something that I've heard that from them on, and we have it here in the recommendations, which speaks to the economic viability assessment that the province requires. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit around what that process would look like, and how you see that rolling out.
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Jolker. I just wanted to say, yes, the land economics tool and that analysis is something that we are looking at in regards to understanding the implementation of certain policies and procedures, so that the province has asked that we make sure that it's viable when we do policies, so that there isn't any, we don't create policies that actually stop growth. We want to create policies that increase growth, and we have to inform it from a land use economics perspective and study, which we have not done yet, but have put it in for 2025 to do that, so we can inform the policies that we need to do. And that also will help us with our development cost charges and our amenity cost charges and inclusionary zoning, density bonusing, and all those things. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, and really that assessment is done per zone or per site, or is it across the city?
The study will have to look at the city as a whole, and then if we're going to propose certain zoning, what does that mean as far as impact on development costs? And so it'll be broken down eventually into areas within the city, but it's going to be for the whole city. Like, we have to look at it in that way because of, in particular, infrastructure modeling and how that's structured as well.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Councillor Jolker, and thanks for the great report. I guess we can probably move on to the recommendation. Right, it's been moved and seconded. Are there any further questions on the motion on the floor? Seeing none, all those in favor? And the motion carries. And again, thanks very much for the detailed report. It was really nice to read that and get that information. So we'll move on to 2.1.2. Oh, Councillor Jolker.
Yeah, I did have a question, but it's not urgent. But in terms of the vote, I just couldn't unmute my microphone. There was a section in the report that spoke to the school district, and one of the things that I think is important when we talk about growth, and there is briefly a map on health services and clinics and hospitals, and I wonder, given that there seems to have been extensive conversations with our colleagues over at the school district, if there's an opportunity to share the report with the Division of Family Practice and the Comox Strathcona Regional Hospital Board and Island Health. I'm really cautious that we've just very recently overcome a significant shortage of family and primary care practitioners in the Comox Valley. And I would want to ensure that our partners in the health system are aware of the growth modeling that we've projected. And so just wondering if staff can speak to this report being sent to some of our colleagues over in health as well.
Through the mayor to Councillor Jolker, yes, this will be a public document, and it'll also be available on the web page as well. And so we're happy to send a link over to those various agencies for them to have that direct link to the actual report.
Thanks.
All right, thanks for that. And all right, so now I think we're ready to get into our next presentation. I think it was about the same amount of slides, wasn't it? Or maybe a few more. So maybe without further ado, we'll move right into that.
Well, a long-awaited development cost charge and amenity cost charge bylaw update is before you tonight. We have Nancy Henderson here. And we also have Jessica Wang and Eric Sears, I think, on Zoom as well. Just Jessica, who's also been supporting us with this report. What I wanted to do is really talk about the scope of this report. As council's aware, this was a strategic priority back in 2022, and it was initiated, but then paused, that we've discovered a bunch of issues with population growth, which would impact this study. So with the complete communities and the housing needs assessment coming into play, that really helped us to inform our work in how do we go about updating the development cost charges. And then we had Bill 46 come in that said, hey, you've got some new tools now. And so having to look at that as well. So that the project grew substantially from where it was in 2022. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then because this is it's a very large, complex topic, what we have done is broke it into 2 phases. So tonight's presentation is about phase 1, and it's about providing a strong understanding about DCCs and how they're calculated, and how do we establish an amenity cost charge, looking at our development growth and looking at different financial tools and talking about growth, because as you can see, the complete communities assessment has highlighted a very large change in our growth projections, and how are we going to manage that. We also have infrastructure that we've identified that is making areas of the city unattainable for development, and particularly in the south. And then understanding what the growth is with these projections and what do we need from an infrastructure point of view to help us meet our growth targets and our housing needs that have been that we must meet for the provincial legislation. So what we are laying out tonight is basically we want to have a common understanding about the best practices for development cost charges and amenity cost contributions. And we want to be able to make sure we're aligned with the city goals. And we want to understand what the measures of this success is for this as we move forward in the development of these rates. And we want to discuss with council, what are the objectives of growth management, and what is our approach to financing growth. Those are key questions that help us guide how we build out the rates. Staff has looked at the current rates. We've been working over the last 8 months throughout all the departments to understand all the development cost charge projects that currently exist, and then what projects could be utilized in the amenity cost contributions. We are limited by legislation on what we can apply DCCs to and what we can apply amenity cost charges to as well. In your report, there was just a process chart that we're going to walk through tonight and walk through the various components of both of those processes. What we'd like to leave today with is a robust discussion and some guidance on how we're going to look at growth, and that will help us to come back to council with phase 2, which will actually have the proposed rates for discussion. We are going to give you some comparables tonight so that you can understand where other municipalities are at and the trends that we are seeing with those rates. And then we will come back to council in the first quarter with a proposed rates, and there also have to be proposed community engagement as per the legislation, and we will outline that as well. Kind of talked ahead here. So the key questions that we really wanted to ask council tonight is like, who should pay for the services by growth? And what are the community's values and attitudes regarding growth and development? Can you attribute all costs of growth to certain beneficiaries? Is it clear what services or portions of are to be paid for by development, and what are they and which are to be paid for the greater community. So these are just key questions that we want council to consider as we walk through the presentation tonight, and we will pause again in sections of this so that you can answer questions as we proceed through. So with that, I'm going to ask Nancy Henderson to come up and we will start about the cost of growth.
Thank you. I will continue here. Okay, so the cost of growth, quite often working in the development industry on the application side, it's like, well, this is going to create this great tax revenue, which it does, but some types of land uses are much more effective at being revenue positive than others. So sort of as a general rule of consideration, sprawling sort of low density development often doesn't actually pay for the operation and maintenance of the infrastructure, where more dense multi-use development is generally revenue positive. And that's something that was obviously part of council's decision making when you were doing your OCP in 2022, because it's quite evident that that was your focus. But the ongoing cost of the operations and maintenance of infrastructure is a very significant cost to the municipality, and often referred to as the gift that keeps on taking. And right now across Canada, we have a major infrastructure deficit because there hasn't been that investment in asset management and also upgrading infrastructure to meet future needs. So very timely conversation, considering that the game is also just being changed in how we negotiate infrastructure and amenities for our communities, with having to pre-zone for 20 years of growth. So really good planning and updating your master plans and getting into this sort of cycle. I can't emphasize how important it is. One of that sort of green and red map at the bottom of the screen is not a Christmas decoration. That is from the city of Kelowna, who has invested millions of dollars on sort of modeling financial implications of growth, and they use it as like an evidence-based decision-making tool. They've turned down developments based on the results of that model. I just wanted to point it to you because there's decision-making that you guys do around the table on all these development applications that have strong relationships to the financial viability of the city, which I know you know, but it's always good just to look at the other tools that are out there. So financing growth, it comes at a cost. You need to know what that cost is and track it. The more strategic you can be with growth, then the less it's going to cost. And in some cases could be a revenue generator for the city. Most municipalities, not all, but they have a philosophy that growth should pay for itself, and that the existing taxpayer shouldn't be subsidizing future growth. Not all. I mean, there's lots of northern communities, for example, that might be paying for infrastructure to facilitate growth because they're trying to attract investment to their community. But in most cases, it is a fairly positive philosophy in terms of financial sustainability, and needing to sort of balance that growth with the supporting amenities and infrastructure and the city's ability to pay for those. So it's quite a loaded little teeter-totter there. The three factors when you're considering sustainable infrastructure, the denser that the development is, the closer proximity it is to infrastructure, and the different types of land uses generally equate to financial sustainability and a better sort of balance of your sort of fiscal health. So this is a slide that's very familiar to you from your previous presentation, but there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be upgraded in the community. It's not viable for growth to occur everywhere all at once, as we discussed before, and that it would be strategic to sort of focus growth on areas that you can provide that infrastructure moving forward. There is more new legislation that also is impacting this DCC review from the time we started it to where we are now. So some of that is the incremental change associated with SHMU. There's also a wider scope of development cost charges that we will also talk about in a future slide. I think something to really remember, this is a little bit like why now as well, is that your last major development cost charge update was 2005. It's based on a whole different city, different priorities, different plans, and very significant different costs. There was a minor update that was, I think, more based probably on 2015 costs, but it was adopted by council in 2016. So if anyone was looking at building a house in 2016 and you want to build a house now, you know that those construction costs are completely different. So you're essentially leaving money on the table. You're not collecting enough money to pay for the needed infrastructure. So it's like you're giving a very significant discount every time you're collecting DCCs. So it's very, very important to be looking at your DCCs. So it's very great that the city is undertaking this process to meet the needs of future development. The new legislation in terms of the DCCs, due to much lobbying at UBCM over the years, there are new DCCs charges that you can collect. I'll go into them in more detail as we move through the slides, but you have fire protection facilities, for example, fire halls, police facilities, solid waste and recycling facilities, if not operated by the region. Transportation, this is a big one in terms of provincial highway infrastructure under certain conditions that you can also be collecting. Before the municipality had to own the road in order to collect DCCs on it. Now, if you're under agreement with the Ministry of Transportation and there's a shared benefit, you can also collect the municipal portion from DCCs as well. So those are great new tools. In addition, we have the amenity cost charge, and sorry for all the acronyms, but it's so much easier. So it's providing the local governments with the authority to levy amenity cost charges to pay for all of these things that municipalities have been lobbying for years, particularly in and around parks. The existing DCCs are very limited, so it allows for more parks and also facility improvements, and we'll get into exactly what it can cover. So yeah, the legislation is in there. In the previous presentation, Councillor brought up about the consideration of economic impact and the analysis. So all of these charges should not be set so high that they're deterring development. So that's a balance that you need to play and weigh out. Right now, the legislation says that there should be consideration of the economic impact. There isn't a scope on what that needs to look like. And I think what the province has in the legislation as well is that they can come up with regulations to essentially say this is going to be the scope. So I think it's right now the expectation isn't that high, and that you don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of economic assessment to support your ACC, but you do need to consider it as you move forward. The ACC also requires by legislation consultation. The DCC, it's encouraged. And then you just adopt the bylaw. You do not need to have minister approval like you do in DCCs. And we'll get into this in more detail as we move through. I think it's important to note that development cost charges and amenity cost charges are just two tools of many that are available to you. And it's finding, which is the best tool for the right situation. But these tools have become much more important when we're looking at the sort of suite or the tools in the toolbox based on sort of needing to pre-zone. Density bonusing is another one that's gaining popularity, but again, from a land use economics analysis, it's very important to do it right. There's more examples of it not working well than there is really good examples. So use caution when you come to that one. But yeah, so there are two tools. How do you choose the right one? I think it's really important that you kind of have to look at them all. It's not a prescriptive strategy. You need to be flexible based on the circumstances. But, in terms of things that can influence, like what makes a good DCC project, quite often like ownership structure, for example, if you're only dealing with like a master plan development with one owner, it's not necessarily the best tool. You might be wanting to do a development works agreement because it's really one owner benefiting from that infrastructure. When the infrastructure is shared by many across the municipality, DCCs are a great tool. It's really important as well, the factor you have a program, and the part 2 or phase 2 of this presentation, we're going to really dive into the programs and the costs associated with it, but it all has to be feasible and fundable over time. So this sort of ties into that idea of strategizing and prioritizing development across the city so that you're bringing in that infrastructure at the right time. So yeah, there's who benefits and what are the impacts on others. So in terms of the affordable housing and economic impact, there are tools for council to also reduce development cost charges, as you have already done recently. I believe last June you did a reduction on not-for-profit housing, for example, but that does come at a cost to the taxpayer, in that you have to make up that difference in the program through other sources of income. And one of the questions that, we want you to ask as you go through this presentation in terms of the risk tolerance of the city, because if you're not collecting enough money and you want to see development, is the city have the risk tolerance to advance some of that infrastructure without guaranteed growth or development cost charges? So, another, way of looking at ACCs and DCCs is they're just helping the municipality recover the cost of offsite infrastructures and amenity needed for growth. It's based on the principle of cost sharing, so that everyone's paying into the pot versus that one developer kind of taking on that responsibility, which makes sense in some cases, but not all. It's also really good too, because it's very clear and predictable for the developer, and anyone who's been sort of listening to the development application review around the province, that sort of clear, predictable, and transparent is really important to the development community. So that it is, and it is provincially regulated and does need provincial approvals, and there's fairly significant legislation that determines how we do this. It does sort of align with the city's compass in terms of equity, in that it is equitable and that growth is paying for growth, and then it's shared amongst many. And it is, as I mentioned, consistent as well, and provides that certainty, and it minimizes the risk on the city having to advance the cost of this infrastructure needed to grow. And the other thing that's nice about the pre-zoning and DCCs is you're not in that one-off negotiation with developers, which takes a long time through the process. So it's also sort of a high stakes negotiation a lot of the time. And it's very risky for the developer, not knowing what that's going to look like when they go in, but it also speeds up the time a lot, and time is money to the development community. So these are some of the things that you might want to consider in your conversations with the development community as you move forward. So in terms of the process, these have been outlined in the presentation that you have, but we are in phase 1 of the DCC and ACC bylaw update process. So we have estimated growth. We've been working with staff over the last several months and really years kind of on the program and what would be included in it, and estimating the cost. So we'll come back to council once that gets finalized to sort of illustrate and forecast, like, this is what the program's looking like and the associated costs to get your input. And so we're just really wanting to provide this introduction now to council, talk a little bit in generality around your philosophy around the assist factor, which is kind of council's key tool. And then we'll come back to you with the program and then go out for the engagement, and then draft bylaws and bring them back to council. So as Marianne mentioned, we've heard a lot from council, and we've made some assumptions by looking at your OCP, by in our conversations with staff, and we're going to kind of come back to this at the end of the presentation. But, we understand that council's approach and philosophy is that development and growth should pay its own way. So that would be something that we might want to talk about a bit more later in the evening. And that there's also an understanding that you wanted to be directing growth to the growth centers. You're more supportive of infill than greenfield, and, directing growth to where lands can be serviced if cost effectively would also be a priority. And then that there might not be a ton of risk tolerance to front end a whole bunch of infrastructure. But I'm going to come back to you guys, and you can sort of, now that you've had ability to listen to the presentation, Marianne will ask this question again at the end of the presentation. I think we've kind of covered this, like why update now? But really your DCC rate no longer reflects the reality of the city of Courtenay, and it's really important to update because you're essentially leaving money on the table. The cost increases are so significant. And then you're also seeing larger than anticipated growth as well. So you're just not collecting enough funds to make the projects happen. So you need to meet the needs of the future by updating your program. You're not alone. So there's many communities. When we show you the comparisons, you're going to see quite a few communities with bylaws around your vintage in 2015. Interestingly, they're all updating their OCP or their DCCs right now. There's a ton of DCC updates going on around the province, but we recommend that you're doing a minor update every 1 to 3 years. So you're updating those construction costs. The CPI updates are good, but you're limited to CPI, which doesn't necessarily reflect the true construction cost. That one is a much faster, less expensive process than a full update. But we do recommend, especially at the growth rates that you guys are seeing and the changing landscape, every 3 to 5 years to completely redo your DCC program. If you're doing it on that cycle, it gets a lot easier, it's faster, it's not as expensive as well. And then having the master plans sort of come in advance of that review is also really important. Yeah, so if you're not being reviewed, you're not collecting enough funds, and that's certainly what's happening right now. And when you don't have that infrastructure in place and a developer wants to develop, you know how complex it gets because they can't move forward until there's an upgrade and who's going to do it. And that's a very difficult situation. So sometimes not constructing the infrastructure is actually more of a deterrent to development than a higher DCC charge. So I think that's sort of a key point to consider. We do the DCC calculation based on best practice. So we do estimate growth. It's a case when kind of referring to some of the previous council questions is we want to estimate growth. It's important that we don't overshoot it and that we're taking a more of a conservative approach. Because if you overshoot growth, you're not going to collect enough DCCs. If you undershoot it, then the costs are higher than they need to be. So we need to balance that. And that's another good reason to be updating it frequently. We determine the cost of all the projects. Then we determine who's benefiting. So if you look at a DCC program, quite often you're going to see a percent. So the existing taxpayer might benefit from an infrastructure upgrade. So there would be a percent allocated to the taxes essentially of the municipality, and then a percent allocated to the developer. And so that's the DCC is calculated based on the developer's fair share, if you will. And we'll get into more of this in phase 2. And then the assist factor is council's tool. I'll talk about that a bit more and tell how you can help reduce rates if you wish to do so. And then we calculate the DCC rates. We can always come back to you with part 2 or phase 2 with the DCC rates, and council goes, oh, that's higher than I feel comfortable with. We want to utilize our assist factor till, let's do the calculation. How's that going to affect us? And we'll definitely work through it with you. We're not expecting a definitive answer tonight. As mentioned previously, engagement is recommended. It's a best practice for development cost charges. It's required for amenity cost charges as part of the new legislation. It's not something that the general community tends to have a lot of interest in. It's more the developers, and you have a great developer forum and communication with that development community now. We do recommend that the program, the background study, be available, the rates, the draft bylaw, for example, on your website or social pinpoint so that the larger community can also see it and comment if they wish. And we'll work to staff in future phases and exactly what that engagement will look like with future direction from council as well when we come back next time. As mentioned before, this in-stream protection piece. So it's also like we need to make sure we're collecting enough money for the infrastructure projects that have been identified, but those that have already submitted building permits and subdivisions or zoning bylaws do have for example, precursor applications, we call them, have 12 months to get that building permit out the door issued. And they can pay the existing DCC today. They don't have to pay the new one. So something to note for your building department is there will likely be a rush to get building permits issued before new fees come into effect. So it's something to think about. So there's a lag basically as well in that money coming in. Any new applications would pay the new fee. ACCs, does anyone have any questions before I kind of do a bit of a deeper dive into the amenity cost charges, just based on the overview?
Wow. It does seem that there are some questions, so I'll go first to Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. Just curious about the timing of, it seems that you feel it advisable for council to develop a fairly clear position and then go and engage with the developers rather than the other way around.
Through the chair, and we'd recommend presenting the rates to council so that you know what they are. And that you can talk about them and maybe provide some direction. And if you're feeling they're too high, then you might say, you know what, based on that, we'd like to look at the assist factor and we'd like to look at the financial, because there's a financial implication to the assist factor as well. What is that? We'd like to understand that. And then go to the development community. But once you hear from the development community, there'd be an opportunity for council to provide additional direction based on that engagement. I think it's really important though, like it's what I call it is a technical exercise with a political lens. So, I mean, the projects are the projects that are needed to facilitate growth, and that's based on, engineering reviews and technical studies. But, it's something that council might feel that we also can't deter development, so that's another thing. But if they're feeling that they're too high, then you can use the assist factor, and we'll talk about that as we go along, because there's also ways you can phase it in over time and things like that. So.
Excellent. And just for Councillor Jolicoeur, there are a few lights on ahead of you, but I do see you have your hand up. And I think, in the past we have had the developer working group, and so there may be other opportunities not focused on DCC, but to have conversations. But yeah, thanks for that. Councillor Gall.
Yeah, so I think we're just doing clarifying questions, and we're going to have the discussion at the end, right? Yeah, so just for clarity, the phase slide didn't have timelines on it. So just wondering, not to nail it down, but roughly on that slide. And then if the ACC work is expected to run in parallel or separately.
Through the chair, the ACC and DCC are expected to run parallel unless directed otherwise by council. And then in terms of timing, we've been working hard with staff to kind of get that program. We still have some questions and things that we're working through. I could let Marianne answer the exact timing, but I mean, we're hoping early in the new year to get that nailed down.
Thanks, Ms. Wade.
Yeah, through the mayor to Councilor McComb. Yes, what we're trying to do is come back with the rates. At probably the first meeting of February, and then from there we will get council's direction. Then we'll go out, and when we come, we will lay out the engagement plan, which will be meeting with the development community, and we will be setting those up with our development group. And we will work with them going through that process, and we will also send up a social pinpoint, as Nancy had said, and then we will also and there'll be a tight time frame on this, so that we will bring it back to council for council to consider it, and we're looking at targeting that probably the beginning of May, in the May area, and then going through the bylaw process May and June, so that we can, that's our goal. But of course, if we bring it to council, there's other directions, or there's other things, of course, we would adjust.
Right.
And Mr. Garbett had a comment as well, or? Oh.
Yeah, just another quick comment. Yeah, that all makes sense to me. And I mean, I think that was kind of my assumption, but it's, it's hard to say when there's all these, different steps laid out. And, yeah, the engagement piece can be a fairly concise process or something that's like longer. One comment I just wanted to make on the engagement, although maybe we'll have another discussion on it further in the meeting, is yeah, like, I mean, clearly the impact is on the development community. And of course, that's where the bulk of the engagement will go or will happen. But I think engagement on this is an opportunity to educate the wider public on what DCCs are. And we have ACCs, which are new in the province. And, you know, I think it is important for the public to understand that not getting this right represents a subsidy that homeowners will be paying if we're, you know, not looking at this in a full way. So I would like to see that also communicated out in some way through this process. So thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum and Councillor, or not Councillor, Mr. Garbutt.
Yeah, thank you through the mayor to council. Just want to follow up a comment from the mayor. So the engagement on the DC is very rigorous. So informal conversations don't, the ministry and the province who are taking an extra special interest in DCCs now. So just want to be really clear that engagement plan that will be presented to council to engage the development community will be specific and rigorous and meet the legislation. So I'm sure there would be other kinds of dialogue, but that is what we will document and report back on specifically. And the development community knows that's their specific way to engage on this, and that will be the ruler with which the province measures these things. I just want to clarify that.
Thanks very much. And Councillor Frisch.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm wondering if I'm understanding this right. When it comes to DCCs, there's a list of projects, and would those be informed by our master plans that we currently have? And I guess what I'm wondering is, you know, something like a transportation master plan, we generally plan to fund that through taxation and grants. And I just wonder what the effect would be if, you know, we start putting it into DCCs and collecting money for it and then apply for grants. Like, does that affect those programs?
Through the chair, you know, generally, and again, your master plans need to get updated, and as you update them, the next DCC update will become easier and easier. But generally, what we like to see is the master plans are already identifying like what is the benefit allocation of this project, how much of it would benefit growth, and how much would it benefit the existing presentation or the population, sorry. And that would be embedded right in that master plan. But that's something that we're working through as staff in determining those benefit allocations if it hasn't already been done so. In terms of grants, basically the grant needs to be in hand in order for it to get factored into the DCC program, and it would get reduced accordingly. And another reason to be updating the DCC program through minor and major updates is to factor in those grants and so that's reducing the DCC load.
Yeah, and just for understanding, I wonder if you guys know what the municipal assist factor was used in 2016 for that minor update.
Through the chair, it was 1% across the board. And we'll talk a bit more about assist factors, but generally most are 1 to 5, but there's other larger assist factors in certain circumstances out there, which we can talk about.
Is that quite low, 1%?
1% is the minimum, but it's the most common is sort of that 1 to 5% range.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Frisch and Councillor Gilliker.
Thanks. 2 questions of clarification. The in-stream application, how are we defining that?
Through the chair, it's defined by legislation essentially, but it's like a complete application received prior to the date of the bylaw. So for example, if you applied for a building permit and it wasn't issued, it has to be like issued by that date. So you'll see a rush of complete building permit applications. So that's something we'll work with staff on, is that you want to make sure that you're not accepting incomplete applications just to get under the radar on the new DCC charge. And that's something that's quite common in terms of implementation practice.
Yeah, and that was actually where my question was coming from, was the idea that I imagine that folks, when this is passed, we'll try to move through the development process, maybe not necessarily understanding that there are timelines assigned to that. And so to be clear, we're not planning to change our current practice in development services for those who may not have sent in complete applications to get them through the finish line prior to adoption. Is that correct?
And through the chair, yeah, a complete application must be received prior to the date of adoption. And then that must be issued, that building permit must be issued within 1 year. And if it's not, then they would have, the new DCC would apply. So yeah, there's very typical parameters that would also generally come out in terms of communications with the development industry and applicants, and making sure that information is readily available and clear well in advance of adoption.
Great. And my second question for clarity is the DCC list that's referred in the staff report, and Councillor Frisch just mentioned it. Is that something that will be provided in the next staff report?
Through the chair, yes, that's the intention, is that the program will be provided as well as the DCC rates.
And Ms. Wade had a comment as well.
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Jokel, I also wanted council to be aware that the practices and how we've been taking in applications have changed over the last year, so that we're making sure that we do have complete applications with all the required information that, associated with it. So if there was necessary studies and those sorts of things like infrastructure or environment, we're asking for those to be part of the complete application. So that we do have what Nancy Henderson's talking about in regards to that complete form, and we're going to have a very clear understanding of what that is. And then the other thing is that once that bylaw is adopted, is that if it's not complete, it wouldn't apply. So they would go under the new rates. Then you have to achieve what you're trying to achieve with your permit, be it a subdivision or a building permit, and that has to be done and built within that 1 year. If you don't make that 1 year timeline, then it reverts back to the new DCC rates. And we will outline that, and we will be setting up a social pinpoint page that actually does that, and updating it so that everybody clearly understands when we embark on this in the first quarter, where we're going, having the background information and that education as well.
That's great. Great to hear. Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Yeah, one last question for me on this part. Getting back to one of the first slides that you had up that kind of outlined, you know, how different types of development have different infrastructure costs, and that growth in some areas are less costly to the public than others. You know, if we're really thorough and detail oriented in how we calculate these fees, I mean, I do understand that sometimes DCCs are different in different areas, depending on what projects are associated with development in one part of town or another. At least that's how I thought they worked. Well, no, so it's a blanket.
Through the chair, just to clarify, generally in smaller communities, there's like a 1 DCC rate across the board. Larger municipalities might have what we call sector DCCs, but there's sort of a risk to doing that unless you're a much larger municipality, because you're not collecting enough to do the projects if it's too small. So generally it's like 1 DCC shared by all across the city.
Okay, so even if there's different projects in town, it's one rate that funds, it is a blanket. Okay. All right, well, that answers my question, because I did think that we had different ones in different areas. So that's just a misunderstanding on my part. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks for that. I had a couple questions. One had to do on slide 19, which was the DCC review best practices. It just kind of has some timelines on there, and but there are kind of ranges, and I just wondered, you know, when it talks about the 1 to 3 years for minor ones, and then the 3 to 5 years for sort of the major DCC reviews, and we're sitting here with one that is frankly almost 20 years old. So I mean, we're well past the best before date. So totally appreciate where we are, and this has been great. But I'm just wondering if, you know, when we're looking at it, if it makes, when we're coming up with a policy, if we say, you know, the minor one is kind of like every 2 years and the major one's every 4 years, And then that way there's kind of like, I guess, just some consistency that we build in, and knowing that sometimes you get zingers that send you sideways and things get delayed, but Ms. Wade.
Yeah, through the mayor to council, thanks for that question. And one of the things is once we do the major update, then that allows us for 4 years to do a CPI inflationary bylaw.
Mm.
So the idea with the cycle is that we do the major update and then we do the inflationary at the 4 years. And then when you're getting to about year 3, we're starting to look at how do we update our master plans to inform and with our adjustment to growth so that then we do the major update for 5. And
Right.
we're not in that cycle yet. We
Yeah.
have just started with the 2 CPI inflationary ones. And that was because there was an amendment made to the DCC bylaw in 2022. So that gave us the ability for the next 4 years to actually do that CPI index. So that's how we're trying to go. And so that's sort of the explanation with those cycles is how do we get into that cycle
Mhm.
so that we're consistently doing CPI index and then we're doing our major.
Yeah. And then, of course, it's hard for me not to conflate the 2 presentations and saying, well, if we're doing the OCP every 5 years, is it better to align this to that, because it's got a range of dates, that 5-year thing, and then do the minor one every 2.5, or like you said, we got CPI kind of helping us not get as far behind, but and I guess these are big ifs, but and again, I don't know if I'm conflating those 2 things too much, but if there is some synchronicity that happens with the OCP.
Through the mayor to council, yes, we are trying to get into that synchronicity and sequencing. And that's why we've been working really hard as a team, like all the departments, to highlight all the plans we need to do and then the projects. And then we realize that the master plans need to be done so we can inform even with more detail the DCC project list. Right now, we have to work with what we have from existing projects, understanding our growth and what we know about constraints in our infrastructure so we can position where development can best go at this time until we can do those master plans and inform and get into that sequence.
Okay, awesome. I really appreciate those answers. And then the next thing, I may have just heard, it might have been wishful thinking maybe, but I heard something about where if there's provincial sort of owned projects, if that makes sense. Like I think about the Cliff Avenue corridor or the Ryan Road corridors, where there's projects like putting in a signaled crosswalk, maybe, or maybe upgrading the facilities on Ryan Road, that kind of stuff. Did I hear correctly? Like we have the ability to kind of partner and maybe get into the weeds, maybe, but like, would we be able to help? We could be a better partner with them to help accelerate those programs or those projects.
Yeah, through the mayor to council, yes, one of the things is that in discussions that we're having with the agencies, in particular, Ministry of Transportation and Highways, but I think it's infrastructure. They changed their name just recently.
Of
So
course, of
I think
course.
it's MOTT now, MOTT. So anyways, yes, we're having those discussions with them about those projects because we do have the ability now to identify those infrastructures and create DCC projects and association and agreement with our agency partners. So we are in those discussions and looking how we move that forward.
All right. No, I appreciate that. And I'll maybe just, since we're doing questions, I'll do a time check. We are at 6 o'clock. We're likely to be based on how fast we've been moving, another hour or so. Do we want to take this as an opportunity to have a dinner break and maybe take 20 minutes and then come back with fresher and fuller minds? That sound good? Okay. All right. Let's take a dinner break and we'll come back approximately 6:20. All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Evan, you can take a break too. Ready to rock. All right, thanks, everybody. We're going to get back to our ACC overview, and I'll pass it back to staff, and I'll turn on the microphone for the podium.
Thank you. I'll continue on what are ACCs. So ACCs are a new tool. They're a one-time charge to pay the capital cost of amenities that provide a social, cultural, heritage, recreational, environmental benefit to the community. So what's a capital cost? You know, it's typically like that piece of bricks and mortar construction, but it could also be the planning, legal, engineering costs that go into like the design of that piece of infrastructure as well. It can be also a municipal charge, or it could also be a charge from the regional district as well. You could each have an ACC if you so pleased. You could enter into a partnering agreement with a partner that's building the facility and utilize those funds to help pay that facility, but it can only be growth driven. It's really close to a DCC, but it is different legislation. It does make sense if you're doing a review to do them both at the same time, although many municipalities that have recently done a DCC review are now doing ACC reviews separately. It is regulated by the province. There's no minister approval with them like there is with DCCs, so it's a slightly different process. The ministry has come out with some interim guidelines. They're in the process of developing a new best practice guide as well. So that's expected to come out and could continue to sort of slightly revise what best practices are for ACCs, but that is yet to be released. So some of the things that could be used to fund libraries, rec centers, or athletic facilities, the community senior center, for example, daycares is one that's often getting used in some of the new programs that are coming out, public squares, public art. It's not an extensive list, but there's some pretty good examples provided by the province. What you can't do is you can't double charge. So if you're collecting for something under the DCC program, you can't collect for the same thing under the ACC program. But one thing, especially when you think of amenities, people are often thinking of parks and recreation. And we'll get into the Parks DC a little bit later, but it's quite restricted as to what you can spend Parks DCCs on. So the ACC can provide for some of those costs that you couldn't collect under the Parks DCC. And again, like it must be growth related. So if you're doing a project that has a benefit to the existing population, then you'd be sharing the cost and you can only attribute the growth related cost to the developers or the ACC. You can't fund operation and maintenance costs with the program. So only capital, can't be used to pay for housing of any kind. There's other legislation that's been released by the province with inclusionary zoning and development cost charges as a tool. Many municipalities have community amenity cost charges that they've been negotiating over the years. And sometimes there's confusion because those are used to sometimes fund affordable housing, but it cannot be paid out to affordable housing at all. And then it can't be levied if a development doesn't result in increased population of residents or workers. So what that's basically saying is if you're doing a commercial development or an industrial development, you're creating and bringing workers in, then you can charge the ACC. And we'll show you some bylaws that have been adopted or are in process that kind of utilize sometimes just residential charges and some with industrial charges. So it's up to the municipality. As mentioned, the inspector of municipality is not required to approve them and you can't double charge. So that's something that's a test in all cases with DCCs and ACCs. This is a graphic that just sort of looks at the tools that you have to pay for different new parks and park infrastructure sustainability. So the operating costs, for example. So the new ACC tool is highlighted so it can pay for some park features that aren't covered in the Parks DCC. But what's really exciting is that it can cover buildings. Or things that are deemed non-parks DCC payable, like artificial turf fields, for example, pickleball courts, tennis courts, along with these other tools to kind of come together to pay for these facilities for the municipality. So we determined the ACC, very similar process to the DCC, is like how much growth is there going to be? How are you going to share this cost? What amenities need to get constructed in the municipality? And I think most municipalities had come up with like super long lists, but then it comes back to, is it going to deter development? So you're going to have to probably choose wisely. In some of the guidance documents and suggestions and best practices is also like consider projects that's also fairly well known to the community or fairly obvious, so that it's not some totally wild and crazy new idea is recommended anyway. And then we prepare the program and then develop the rates sort of based on the project costs and the growth factor. And then there's a requirement. So this is an absolute requirement to consult with interest groups in the public regarding the ACC and allowing feedback. So it's really providing an opportunity for feedback, which could be meeting with the development community and making the information available for the public to provide feedback. And then you go through the bylaw process, much like DCCs. So everyone asks, like, who's doing this? What the early adopters were Burnaby and Pitt Meadows, in that they both have adopted bylaws. I have a list in front of me that I can add 10 names just off the top of my head between Jessica and I brainstorming earlier today. There's a lot of people. I get calls almost probably 2 a week asking for an ACC review because it is a new tool. It's a very exciting new tool. It's something that there's not a lot of grant funding for. So there's a lot of interest in that. We have some comparable rates. Some of them have been adopted. Some of them are publicly available and presented to council. So we're sharing those with you. I have permission from both Comox and Cumberland to share that they are undertaking an ACC rate review as well. So along the same time. And then we also have some information from North Vancouver as well to share with you. So just 2 of the adopted programs, just as an example, like what they look like. So Burnaby has a library expansion, their Confederation Park Community Center, Bonzer Recreation Complex redevelopment, and 2 childcare facilities as part of their program. In conversations with Pitt Meadows, we did complete, Urban Systems did Burnaby's bylaw with them. Pitt Meadows did it in-house with staff. We've reached out to them. They did a very quick ACC. They wanted to make sure they were collecting. They're growing rapidly. So they have like a recreation and cultural facilities, public art, heritage conservation, and environmental conservation. Those are very broad categories. Like some of the questions we have is like, well, what does that mean? We've reached out to staff. They're already looking to sort of tweak their bylaw, make it more specific, but they just didn't want to lose out on collecting as growth is occurring. Looking at comparables, we have a wide range in amenity cost charge or proposed amenity cost charge costs. So looking at the District of North Van right now, so it's not adopted yet, but coming in at over $41,000 for a low density residential unit compared to Oak Bay, which is again not adopted at this stage in that $35,000 range. Burnaby at 26, Pitt Meadows is at 8, and then Abbotsford is almost 8. So just to kind of give you an idea, there's a very wide range and very different contexts between municipalities. Just provided comparison slides in your presentation for you to glance at for the other types of land uses such as townhouse and commercial ACC comparisons. I think what's notable is in the commercial ACC comparisons, not every municipality is charging them to commercial and industrial uses. So that's a decision, are they attracting workers? If that's an area of growth in the community, then you might want to include that. Industrial, same thing. So any questions on ACCs before I move on to a DCC overview?
Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, just quickly. So that $37,000 figure, I think was maybe Oak Bay. I don't know, whatever the most expensive one was. That's in addition to DCCs.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Wow. Okay, thanks.
And
In
Councillor-
many of those, sorry to interrupt, but in many of those communities, you also have to look at the, like the price of real estate, you know, in that suite of goods as well, but.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for that. And Councillor Jolicoeur.
Thanks, Mayor. If you go back a few slides, the kind of timeline for the ACC work speaks to technical inputs related to the development of the ACC list. And so is there an opportunity for council perspectives in the development of that list?
Through the chair, absolutely. So when we bring forward the programs as phase 2, is those programs will be available for council. And then there's costs associated with those, which are the technical inputs. And then these, the recommendations from staff are like pulling from master plans, for example, like the Parks and Recreation Master Plan identifies like facility needs, which are great ACC projects. But of course, there's opportunity for council to comment on those. There's probably less opportunity to comment on the projects associated with infrastructure because there's just a little bit less flexibility between getting a pipe to facilitate development than doing, you know, a daycare or pickleball courts, for example.
Yeah,
Did
and
you
I
say
guess
pickleball?
I guess my other curiosity that I appreciated that they listed Public Square there, given our last item on the agenda tonight around the 10-minute communities and the desire and the need for increasing third spaces for communities to gather as we build in density across the community. So I was happy to see that as a explicitly listed ACC option. And I guess the last kind of question of clarity that I have around the list, because it's not mentioned, but are community gardens considered an applicable project for ACCs?
Through the chair, I believe they are. Seems like a reasonable request.
Excellent. Thanks, Councillor Jolicoeur and Councillor Morin.
Thanks, Mayor. I know you've spelt it out and even put it in bold about existing population, things that ACCs can't be used to fund. They need to serve the existing population. So it doesn't necessarily mean that something has to be at capacity. So a pool, for example, that maybe isn't at capacity yet, but you're anticipating growth, but it's also serving to be an asset replacement or address a deficiency. So can you marry those things?
Through the chair, absolutely. So if you, for example, had a 4-lane swimming pool right now and you wanted to build a 6-lane swimming pool, you know, that expansion portion could be funded. Quite often you could just be attributing like 42% as 20 years growth to that expansion cost. But you wouldn't want to, if you're tearing down a 4-lane swimming pool and replacing it with a 4-lane swimming pool without any other expansion facilities, that's more operations and maintenance.
Okay, so it's to the benefit to make it bigger and better. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And one of the things you talked about was communities that have decided to just, you know, cast a wide net immediately for ACCs. And so, you know, and it's something that's new. And I guess for me, one of the questions is the timeline. Like, you know, it's not something that's been available for a while, but, you know, are we losing anything significant by not casting that sort of wide general net and then tweaking it over time?
Great question. So, I mean, it comes back to what's the growth? How much are you be collecting? And then what can you pay for using those funds? And if you have, you know, you could have a long list, but I mean, really, what can you collect for and construct in that 20-year period? So that's like sort of that technical analysis to make sure that you'd be collecting the money to potentially pay for, say, a recreation center expansion. If you have too many things on the list, it's not really going to be feasible to construct them all. And you're not necessarily going to have the municipal revenue to pay your portion of the cost too. So you want to just balance that with your ability to fund and also how much money are you going to collect within that time frame. So you might want to balance like a longer term project that you might need to wait 10 or so years to save up for with some lower cost tangible benefits that you could show that are the pickleball court or public art, or for example, that are, you could kind of show the benefits of the program that aren't taking away too much from that nest egg to build that big, expensive facility that's hard to fund right now.
Right, and maybe just as a follow-up, so if we thought, how long are we from implementation of this? Is this something that's 6 months away, 3 months away, a year away kind of thing?
In terms of implementation of the program, I mean, we're hoping to be having bylaws to within sort of 5-6 months, I think was the outline of timeframe that Marianne provided and Mrs. Wade provided.
Excellent. Okay, I think that kind of answers my main questions, and then I'm sort of assuming, because then there's going to be the layering like we have with DCCs with the regional districts, so they'll be doing their lists as well. And is there because it's new, is there some communication that's happening between local governments or the regional district and the city? Ms. Wade.
Through the mayor to council, we've actually been working with our colleagues, and Ms. Henderson's group, Urban Systems, has been involved as well, so that we're actually working with planning, TAC, and infrastructures to outline the growth impact on both our DCCs and the regional ones, so that we can coordinate together on that. So those conversations have started with, and we're trying to inform each other.
Awesome. Great to hear. Mr. Garbett.
Through the mayor, this topic was recently discussed at the Recreation Commission, and I know, I think Ms. Saunders might have a little bit information as well to add to the comments from Ms. Wade.
Ms. Saunders.
Thank you, through the mayor, to council. My understanding is that the Recreation Commission recently directed staff to start investigating what an ACC program at the regional level would look like. And I believe that's being led by Doug DeMarzo, the General Manager of Community Services. And in that direction to staff was also that the CVRD staff approach the local councils to ask for city staff time to support that work and coordinate that work to make sure that we are understanding the impacts of potential regional ACCs on local and vice versa. So I think that decision was just completed a number of weeks ago, and so fairly recent, but there is an intention to be in coordination on that.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Oh, yeah, Mr. Garbett.
This is generating lots of staff comments. I just would say this is an example of some of the conversations we've been having between the administrators about aligning work and ensuring that when discussions happening at the regional table, that there's a request to have staff available. So whenever that, I would say, referral or topic is identified and sent over, we really appreciate that. And I know that the people who live in the development community and planning approvals through the regional TAC, of which our director and manager in the long range area attend, that work is happening, but that actually intentional acknowledgement and discussion about staff time is very much appreciated.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that. Councillor Frisch.
Thanks, Mayor. What would the risk be to have a bunch of projects that get collected for the next 10 years and then find that a future council or community is no longer interested in those projects?
Future, I haven't really seen that happen in terms of like DCCs because it's so technical. I mean, if you didn't have a certain development move forward, for example, then the program would change, and then that would be something you would take off the program potentially as the impacts of that area on the DCC. So like another reason to do the review is it allows another council to potentially comment on it. So that is, I mean, you can't fetter future councils, but ACCs are completely new. So it's a hard one to kind of predict, but that could happen. But you have money in a reserve fund that is being collected for the purpose of those projects. But I suppose if you had multiple projects on the ACC bylaw, you could keep the reserve fund to fulfill those projects.
I'm just thinking of having this really long list of ACCs that eventually, a future council may not want to tax to get the other portions for. And I guess that's why you have to be reasonable when making these lists.
And through the chair, like one thing we would recommend is to be quite broad in, in the way that you're coining the terms like rec center expansion. I mean, you're a growing community. Over time, you're going to need rec center expansion space. But you don't have to be like super specific on those tasks as well.
Understood. Thank you.
Excellent. So that makes good sense. You're not saying like we need 4 treadmills or something like that. It's something much more specific. But I think one follow-up that I have that tweet, because one of the things I saw on the list was say something like public art. And so if public art, is that money earmarked for public art? And I think to Councilor Frisch's question, and then a future council says, we're not interested in public art, the funds collected would then just go to other ACC projects?
That'd be correct.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. I appreciate that. And I don't see any other further questions, so we'll continue on.
Okay. And I think just one other thing, just to clarify before we leave ACCs, is that the municipal government can collect an ACC, the regional government can collect an ACC, and that you would use it for those projects. If you're collecting, you would collect for the regional government's portion, just like you do in the infrastructure projects, and then have to remit those collected funds to them. Okay, so DCCs, something that council is probably a little more familiar with. There are some changes that we've pointed out previously in terms of fire protection facilities, police facilities, and solid waste and recycling facilities as the expanded program as per the new legislation. The draft program that we've been working with staff on does include fire protection facilities in it. So that will be coming to council for consideration. I think there's been some conversation in the future regarding police facilities, but that's not something that we're pursuing at this time. And solid waste is a regional service, so that would not apply. So one thing in terms of it cannot be used is the parks need to serve the existing population. So if there's an existing deficit, then you can't use it to fix any existing deficiencies, just like infrastructure and asset replacement, like that 4-lane swimming pool. Same kind of deal with DCCs. You can't upgrade a failing pump station, for example, utilizing DCCs. If you make it larger, then you can fund the portion that benefits growth with DCCs and then utilize the general revenues to fund the rest of the project. So that must be growth related, no operations and maintenance costs similar to ACCs. And then anything that's already eligible under an ACC, like that rec center expansion, for example, can't be funded through the DCC programs, and no fire trucks or police vehicles or equipment like that. So Parks Project is always good just to clarify, because this is a sticky one. And I know there's been a lot of lobbying at EBCM over the years, and the ACC is kind of a response to that. But Parks DCCs is like for acquisition. So if you have goals in your Parks and Rec master plan, have like a certain per capita percentage or amount of park, all 100% of that acquisition cost can be funded through DCCs. When it comes to improvements, there's a couple different methodologies, but quite often it's like that 42% growth gets attributed to improving the parks because there's the benefit to the existing population. I have seen some exceptions to that in different approaches, but generally the DCCs is very basic in terms of like fencing, landscaping, drainage, irrigation, trails, restrooms, change rooms, playground equipment, and like goalposts and stuff like that. But there's nothing, no artificial turf, no pickleball courts, no tennis courts. Those are all ACCs. So how we determine, very similar to what we talked about with ACCs, is we do the growth projections. We look at all of the capital costs and required timing for a list of projects in every single category. So there's a long list of roads and drainage projects, sewer, water, and then come to look at the benefit allocation. What can we attribute to growth? What can't we? And then this is when we come to council, and we kind of wanted you to provide some insight into this tonight towards the end of the presentation, but you'll have another kick at the can, so to speak, in terms of like, what do you feel the assist factor should be, which is your dial to reduce rates, but it comes with a cost. So we have some slides to kind of illustrate what that looks like. The most average typical assist factors are in that 1 to 5% range. We do have some examples where the rates are coming out high, and like a municipality might charge something that's really jumped, for example, transportation, and they'll say it's 15% in year 1, 10% in year 2, 5% in year 3, for example, and they have that written right into the bylaw just to ease it in. So there's some other options for you. And then once you have established that assist factor, then we can determine the rates based on different land use categories. So allocating benefit, we've talked a lot about this already, so I won't spend too much time here. But if there's a low benefit to growth, that benefit allocation is a low percentage. If it's shared, it could be 50-50. If it's a very high growth related project, like you're not going to do it unless there's growth, then that benefit allocation would be high to the DCC and low to the existing taxpayer. And there's a bunch of, through the DCC best practices guide, there's some different ways on how we determine the shared benefit or benefit allocation, which we utilize in all of our work. And then as mentioned, the assist factor is council's tool. This is sort of the political lens to it all. And so this is the amount that you can adjust and essentially pay for through non-DCC revenue. So as long as you increase that assist factor, that money has to come from somewhere else. And that would be up to the CFO to track and also account for annually as part of DCC reporting. And it can vary by program. So like you could have a higher assist factor for say parks and just 1% across the board for everything else, but you can't change it by land use category. So it can't be different for commercial versus residential, for example. So just wanted to show you an example of if you have a 1% assist factor, and this is just on $1 million project. So if there's a 35% benefit to new growth, then that would be $350,000 allocated of that $1 million cost to new growth. $300 or $3,500 is the assist factor, so that's the 1%. So if you look at the final cost to share, and it's going to be the big thing to look at here is the difference from this slide to the next slide. So on that $1 million project, you're looking at, I mean, 300 and like my eyes aren't that good, but $346.5 thousand is the developer's responsibility, and the other $600,500 is the municipal responsibility. Now, if you change that assist factor from 1% to 25%, that municipal responsibility grows now to $737,000. So like an additional, $80,000 for this $1 million project. So you can kind of imagine if you have a $10 million program, that's now an $800,000 impact to the taxpayer. And if you have a $100 million program, which a city of your size is quite easily upwards of that, you're looking at an $8 million impact. So with the assist factor comes a cost, I think is the message that I'm trying to convey. And we can provide some specific examples to your programs as we move forward into part 2. Just reiterating again with DCCs, as with ACCs, there's also in-stream protection. So if there's a complete application received before bylaw adoption, they have a year to issuance of that permit, and then they do not have to pay the new DCC. Okay, so now looking at the comparison of DCC rates through some other communities around the province and your neighbors. When looking at this, so we have some different categories for you. It's good to keep in mind the dates on the left-hand side column. So Courtenay, Comox, and Campbell River all have quite dated DCC programs, and all 3 of those are under review. And so those rates are going to change for those communities. And then we have Parksville is another one with a very old program as well, 2014. Nanaimo is under review as well. And that's a 2018 rate. And then you'll see that Sioux, Victoria, Langford, and Colwood all have fairly new programs, which are substantially more. Looking at it another way, just from a high density residential, there's a couple extra here for comparison. We've got Kelowna and the District of North Van, and they're looking, this is for high density apartment type uses. And so eclipsing, Courtenay at 11,000 to, 27,000 a unit. And there's many others in the Lower Mainland that are much higher than that. There's definitely a trend with construction costs and growth, paying for growth, that are, leaning towards higher rates. And I think that'll be emphasized even more with the new legislation that we have before us. Looking at the commercial rates, these are the same comparisons. So, I mean, you'll see a trend across all examples. It does have a breakdown in terms of the different programs, as well as the regional DCCs, which fulfill, when you look at Courtney's and Comox is obviously with the same region, a very significant portion of the DCCs that you're collecting go to the CBRD. And does anyone have any questions of me before I turn this over to Ms. Wade?
I see Councillor McCollum and a few others. I'm not sure about Councillor Jolicoeur online, but I'll keep my eyes open. Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, just a small question on the last set of slides that you shared. The comparison across communities, that's strictly looking at the city DCCs. So regional districts could be charging or are charging on top of those. And if a municipality is doing its own water treatment, water delivery, then that would be, like, it's not necessarily apples to apples. Am I right in reading that?
Through the chair, we've included the regional rates in these comparisons. So the orange color, and obviously there's different service areas. So for example, the city of Kelowna has all their own services. They don't have any regional services in the DCC categories anyway. So their rates aren't including any regional, but the rest of those examples, other than Campbell River, which is in the same boat, don't. So the orange amount is the amount that you're collecting, but handing off to another organization.
Oh, I see. Okay, so the ones that don't have it just simply don't have them.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great, thanks.
And the purpose of the comparisons, and again, like, it's a technical exercise with the political lens. Every council asks for it. But the projects are the projects, the infrastructure is the infrastructure that's required. So there is a danger to try to be competitive, but it's worth looking at it from that lens in terms of like economic viability and regional sort of marketability. But it is really important that you're providing the projects as needed by your community, more so than trying to come in the same as your neighbor.
And then with the comparisons, like looking at Langford on low density versus high density, they've really financially made it high density a much better option per unit for sure. Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the, I'm trying to remember what the exact name for it is, the assist factor. You said it ranges between 1% and 25%, and I can see that obviously the affordability impact on housing is one reason why a community might choose to have a larger assist factor. Are there any others that I'm missing? Any other reasons for having a substantially higher assist factor that other communities have latched onto?
Through the chair, I mean, it is the political lens to this all, and it could be 99% if a municipality so wished.
Sure.
They tend to be between 1 and 5, but I've certainly seen, I don't know that I have like the empirical data to support this, but my gut reaction is that more municipalities have higher assist factor for parks because I think they feel it's maybe more palatable to have, say, a higher support of parks, which are like publicly accessible by all and not such a strict benefit to growth. I'd say from a political lens, there seems to be more comfort there. But generally, it's just to kind of bring the costs down, to potentially be more competitive in terms of, or make it more affordable. But really, you shouldn't be deterring development with DCCs and ACCs. But we should be looking at the program as well, like when those rates are being determined, and not expecting council to be using the assist factor for that. It's more just the political tool in terms of council feeling the rates are too high, and maybe there's other revenue sources available to a municipality to help support growth.
Okay, great. That's helpful to get a sort of clear idea of the factors. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Cole Hamilton and Councillor Frisch.
Thanks. I'm having a hard time understanding the difference between the different classes and what drives the different pricing. Is it a matter of a completely different program, or is it a matter of assigning different benefits to different categories? Like
Through the chair-
low density and high density in particular piqued my interest.
Through the chair, yeah, the cost, like the programs are based on growth. It's not actually, a municipality can't assign different DCCs over different types of land uses. It's sort of based on how much projected development that you're gonna see in that particular land use category, and then how it sort of weighs into the impact on the overall program.
So what would make a high density development have a lower DCC cost?
Well, high density development tends to have a lower DCC cost because when you're looking at growth and the impact of the infrastructure, and there's more to share across the board, I guess.
I got it.
And it's like often based on like the size of the unit is a consideration. You can also create different DCC categories for different lot sizes. So sometimes you'll see, before we really got into SHMU and increased density, but you kind of had that idea of like creating more dense neighborhoods, you could have like a small lot DCC category and then a large lot DCC category, knowing that more small lots could be created than a large lot, so that they'd be helping pay for that infrastructure at a greater rate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you.
Excellent. I don't see any other questions at this point or comments. I guess, yeah, this has been really great to see, especially these comparisons where you can see how you can use those fees to really help shape or help developers decide. And then you take that information, and I'm not sure if it was the Kelowna data that showed that some of your low density is actually being subsidized by the high density development. But if you change that DCC shape or cost, you can make up for it to a certain extent, I guess, but only in the future, I guess. So, which is, I think, the next part of the conversation.
Good, thank you.
So, the next steps, moving forward. I briefly touched upon the fact that we're gonna go into phase 2, come back to council, probably the first, council meeting in February with proposed rates and, the programs, and have a discussion again with council about those programs, both for the development cost charges and also the amenity cost contributions as well. And then, what we're gonna have is a discussion about the assist factor, and talk about if you did increase the assist factor, what that might look like. And then we would look at the rates and revise those, and then we would take that discussion out to the community, and we would have that discussion with the development industry. But it'll be up in Social Pinpoint and have a public information, and we can have a general survey like on the Social Pinpoint. But the provincial government is very, it's about the development industry, consulting with them, getting that input, and they have very strict sort of formulas about how we engage and what the use of that information is. So we'll outline that in a community engagement strategy when we come back in February. And then once we go through that, we would report back to council with what we've heard, basically, and then make recommendations, and then finalize those rates and prepare draft bylaws for council's consideration. Hopefully trying to conclude by the beginning of July so that we complete at the end of June. We will adjust as we go along. And so we're excited because it's been a lot of work, and we have been working and going through all these DC rates and formalizing and discussing as a team about these rates. So we're basically about 90% there, and then we're just finalizing those to bring back to you. So I just wanted to, I can't move it. Can I go now? Okay. Great. So this is just, again, we started off the beginning of the presentation with where we are. And one of the things we wanted to take away tonight is just confirming our approach to financing growth. And those are some of the questions we've been asking throughout. And what we wanted to sort of end our presentation on today is just confirming, you know, all growth should pay its own way. Is that where council is supportive on? Is there other things we need to know about that? Incentivizing certain types of growth, and then also understanding that are we all in alignment about focusing growth in growth centers and how we're doing infill and in targeting towards the easily serviced lands that we know that we have some capacity in. And then, you know, right now we're currently using the 1% assist factor. Is council good with us moving forward with our proposed rates with the 1% assist factor, or is there something else you'd like us to consider? And then just sort of talking a little bit about, you know, the community risk and tolerance and some of the risks as far as if we're going to front end some infrastructure to accommodate growth. So making sure that we're actually front ending that infrastructure and then we collect the DCCs after, for example, or there's other development tools that we could talk about. So with that, I'm going to conclude and then open it up to questions and discussion so that we can then take that and we will finalize our rates and bring them back to council.
That's fantastic. This has been an amazing presentation. The whole night's been great, but I have to say, you know, these DCC conversations for me started 10 years ago, and to see it articulated this way is fantastic. I did see Councillor Jolicoeur's hand up previously, so are you still wanting to speak?
Yeah, sure.
Councillor Jolicoeur?
I can go. Ms. Wade kind of answered my question, but it kind of goes into the questions that are laid out in front of us on the screen now, which, you know, I think generally I'm supportive of the approach to growth and the types and locations of development. I guess in terms of the assist factor and in the previous slide, the timeline for phase 2, I think Councillor Hillian may have asked this question earlier, but in the engagement plan, I hear is quite prescriptive by the province, and we'll be seeing that in February. But I did, I guess, just get curious about having a council decision on the assist factor prior to engagement with the development community. And so, yeah, I guess I just have some reservations around making a decision rather than maybe seeking some input from those who will be impacted by the decision prior to going to them with already established assist factor, but wondering if you have any insight into if there will be initial conversations with the industry prior to that conversation.
Through the mayor to Councillor Jolicoeur. So the process would be to have to discuss the assist factor and those rates, and then we would take it out to the development industry, have those discussions, bring back what we heard. Then council would have a discussion about that, and at that point, council can make some decisions about whether they want to adjust the assist factor or modify some of the ACC programs. So that's what so the idea is to sort of establish where we're in alignment with growth and what we want to see, take it out to the industry, discuss it, and bring what we've heard back, and have that discussion with council, and council with that information can then provide input on the assist factor and in ACC programs as well.
Excellent. And I see Jessica has a comment as well.
Yes, thank you to the chair, just to answer your question with a little more nuances. Certainly, I can hear your concern around maybe preempting the engagement cycle where you feel like we're making a decision and just going ahead with the presentation of rates. This, if it's any reassurance, it's pretty typical to kind of go in with sort of what you're most comfortable with in terms of financial sustainability for the city. So typically you will see the first round that's presented to the development community set at 1%. So that's typically what you would see. And I would say the feedback that we typically receive from the development community is pretty standard as well. Typically rates are too high. Can we have more time? Can you allow us to phase in these rates so we can adapt to the change? And certainly there is some merit sometimes to those comments, but they are pretty standard. They've gotten pretty good at going and attending these information sessions and kind of providing the same cookie cutter comments back. But from the perspective of how the city would move forward, I would say, going forward with the municipal assist factor that you feel most comfortable with in terms of financial sustainability as a first step, taking those comments, and then as Marianne has highlighted, making the revisions if it is, one, financially sustainable, and two, the desire of council to kind of adjust the levers through the municipal assist factor.
Excellent. Really appreciate the answer there. And Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I'll just quickly pipe in that I'm pretty happy with the concepts you've laid out. And just for clarification, if we wanted to front end infrastructure, I assume we'd be talking about infrastructure in places we're really keen to see in development, such as, in our downtown or in those growth centers that we outlined. And regarding the assist factor, I have no problem suggesting that it would be wise to keep it low and, and not overburden our current taxpayers with these costs. So I also like to point out that any of these projects that do go through will typically, like you said, it's 60% still has to be covered. So it's not like the people here are going to get off scot-free on all these great projects. So yeah, that's the input I have. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Frisch. And Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Yes, just generally, I'm really happy to see that we're at this point in the process. Our outdated DCC fees have been a regular topic at the council table, and I realize this is a huge bit of undertaking getting to this work, but the first time it dawned on me how out of alignment what we are collecting versus the costs of doing infrastructure improvements was the Greenwood trunk, which mostly that sewer project was mostly out of a need for addressing growth. And I seem to recall that DCCs were just a very small percentage of the cost of that capital project. So, I mean, it's just an example of where these costs do get passed on to in this example, ratepayers of everyone that's paying for the sewer service paid for that project, even though it was really to accommodate growth on the east side of our city. And I had some other comments here. Yeah, in terms of, just the approach that, that growth pays for the costs associated with that business, that, it is done by private business, and it's generally not the practice of the public sector to provide subsidy unless it's in an intended way. And really, if we're not being intentional with DCCs, we're essentially subsidizing that development. And to me, where it really does make sense to provide a subsidy is when the nonprofit sector is stepping in and providing non-market housing. That really does change the equation. And I think there's a really good basis for not passing on the costs of growth to an organization that's not in the business of making money off of growth. So I'm happy to continue to apply that policy as we've been doing lately. And I'll maybe leave it at that for now. I think I have a few more comments, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. I don't see any other comments, and I think the comments that have been made are pretty good. And again, seeing how you can actually not just subsidize through DCCs, again, as was talked about, but actually shape things by saying, if you want to do something is, low density or more urban sprawly, it's going to cost significantly more. Because I think we've seen time and time again, there's developments we can look at currently where the costs of supporting it really is being borne by people who are not benefiting from it. So really appreciate how this has been articulated. I didn't see who had their hand up first, so I'm going to go to Councillor Jolicoeur first, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks. Going back to, I think, some of the slides that showed the comparables for high density versus low density, I think one of the things that stood out to me was the Kelowna Parks was quite large under high density. And so, the actual rates that will be put together by staff, will they be grouped together similarly in terms of class? So high density, low density, commercial, because I think that approach of understanding that DCCs and ACCs should and would differ depending on the type of growth that we're talking about makes sense to me. And I'd be curious to know how the layer of the assist factor could play into the different classes, so high, low, commercial. If you have any thoughts on that.
Through the mayor to Councillor Jolicoeur. So I'll break that out a little bit. One of the things we would be doing with the bylaw is that the way the wording is right now, and it had, as we define density in the bylaw, be it single dwelling unit or multifamily, we need to actually look at that in much more of a more detailed lens. And that's something we've been talking about with urban systems, is how do we marry what we're trying to do with our OCP, where we talk about these levels of density and land use, so low, medium, intense, and how do we reflect that in the DCC bylaw? So that is something we will be considering when we bring this forward as well, is that it's important to look at that density piece and align with the OCP and our intent. And then in regards to the other question you asked about assist factor with the different types of uses like commercial, residential, and that, and the variation of using the assist factor for that in the Kelowna example. And I think I might have Ms. Henderson respond to that.
Through the chair, yeah, the assist factor is based on DCC category, so like transportation, sewer, water, for example. It's not based on land use class. So if you were going to turn that dial with the assist factor, you could turn it evenly across those programs, or you could just focus on parks, for example, or sewer, but you can't provide it based on land use category.
Just as a follow-up to that, Mayor, if I can, I'm hearing in the previous conversations 1 to 25%. Is 0% also an option? Do we see 0% for some of those items you've just listed?
Through the mayor to Councillor Curran, no, the minimum is 1%, and that's through the provincial regulations.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Jolicoeur and Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, kind of circling back to the ACC part, in that, it's pretty broad what we can put into that. It seems like it covers basically anything that has a capital cost or pretty close to it from the city, but then we're limited in that, it has to be reasonable and it can't limit development, which seems like it might be a challenge to define. So I guess my thought on that is, as we're developing a new plan and it's a new concept in the community, I imagine that staff have thought this already, but I'm just going to say it, that choosing some projects that are fairly easy for the public to understand how they tie to growth, that it's like, it doesn't need a lot of explaining, and just that they have broad impact. I mean, we do have growth or things equated to growth that can be kind of in one area or another, but if we can find a basket of projects that are, that have the broadest community impact and are the easiest to understand. I think that's like probably the best starting point in terms of, yeah, public engagement on this and understanding why it's important to implement. And then the other comment or question I had was just around the whole front end for infrastructure. I mean, that's a very easy concept for me to understand if it's like, you know, running a sewer line in a, you know, out to a newer area where maybe it hasn't been serviced before. And so there's an upfront cost and then future development needs to pick that up. Something that I'm less clear on is, although maybe like the fire hall, for example, you know, they're like adding a facility like that, there's a piece of it that's tied to growth, but like the area is not changing. I'm just wondering, is there other kinds of front end infrastructure that isn't necessarily like a pipe in the ground or like a roadway?
Good question. So the way the projects are laid out, so if it was a water or sewer or the roads, there's the formula we do that with, right, is laid out. It would only be if we could see that it was like we needed it to support the growth, right, to meet our housing targets or our growth management, right? So it would depend, like the projects are quite regulated, set in stone. So if there was a particular project you were thinking about, I might be able to respond to that better.
Yeah, I guess maybe just like the fire hall and fire halls in general is something that's come up because, you know, in order to do a new subdivision, and like even south of town, like at some point that's another piece that needs to be developed, but typically it hasn't been part of DCCs, and then our thinking around those types of facilities is also changing. I mean, I was interested in the solid waste bullet, although that's not for this table too, but there's things in there that I just haven't seen before that's of interest. So just trying to understand that a bit better.
And through the mayor to council, we did have an expansion just really with the bill that has given us newer tools with the DCCs that we wouldn't have seen before.
Yeah.
Fire hall being one.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Through the chair, just maybe in terms of like reframing front-ending development, like if you wanted to see downtown redevelop more, like you wanted more density there, it's got infrastructure deficiencies right now. So facilitating that requires infrastructure investment. Is the city willing to pay for that upfront so that development comes eventually? And if you think back to the red green map from Kelowna, you know, those are revenue, downtowns can be like revenue positive. So are you willing to front end that infrastructure, or do you want growth to be paying for that infrastructure? Is another way of looking at it.
Yeah, okay, that's actually quite helpful. So sometimes, because front end can be that we collect DCCs for the initial investment. Like, so we would collect a piece of those DCCs later if we front-ended something, say downtown, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. Like if
Okay.
they weren't DCC projects in the program, right? You would just be paying for it because like some communities are like, we want an industrial park, we want to bring employment lands, we're going to facilitate it. Then there's other situations where you might have something that's 20 years down the DCC list and a developer comes along and says like, I want to do it now. Well, that's called like advancing history. So what you basically say is, well, that's not planned for 20 years out. We don't have the money to build it in our DCC program. And they could front end it. So like you can, these terms can sometimes get confusing. The developer could front end it and pay for it. And then you would basically sign an agreement and pay them back over time. So there's a couple different ways that front ending can get confusing in the DCC conversation. But you know, how much does a city want to pay for growth, or do you want growth to pay for growth? Is sort of, I think, the bigger question too.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, thanks for that.
And I was just going to expand a little bit on that too, because these tools are things that we're starting to talk about as far as when we identify projects where maybe the growth to the city is only 25%, but it's 3 developers that have the 75%. So then what is that development agreement where the city would make that contribution of 25%? And then the developers pay for the 75%. And then you have to determine that 25%, is that, was it a DCC project? Or is it benefiting the public? You have to figure out that percent too. So to Ms. Henderson's point, those development tools are all things we're starting to talk about now. And it's coming up again with how we deal with like South Courtney to get development in place, because we have development applications that are there and we don't have the infrastructure in place, and how do we move that forward? So a front ender in that case, might be developers coming forward, and then we pay back through DCC. So there's a bunch of tools like that actually helps with our financial planning as well. Okay.
Excellent. And maybe just a quick follow-up. So, and just because like like a developer pays for something and then there's like latecomer fees and stuff like that, is that a totally separate thing that confuses it? Okay, so maybe we don't go, and is that something we're just trying to get rid of and not do anymore, or
No,
it's just another
they're,
tool?
they're tools. And so again, it's like identifying what that growth is. What's the best financial tool to use in that situation?
Okay.
And that's how we shape the growth and manage our growth.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Councillor Gilliker, you had your hand up, or did you have another comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna, I think my question was answered in the last example of South Courtney, so thank you for that. I was just gonna say, I think this risk tolerance conversation, for myself at least, I think is something that is palatable when we're talking about the identified growth areas that we've agreed to through the OCP and the proposed potential new expanded growth area from downtown. I think that would be something that, at least on a case-by-case basis, that would be something that I would be interested in considering in terms of front-end infrastructure costs. Thanks.
And Councillor Frisch.
Can you think of a project that would that would qualify for front-end infrastructure costs, that we might support as a council? Give us an idea of what sort of project you would think, and then would we in fact put that in the DCC project, but do it ourselves? And then is that the kind of the concept? Charge development in general for it, or would it be just development in that area?
So depending on how we're defining front end, right? So if it wasn't a DCC project, then that would be a different way of actually acquiring that project. So it could be through a latecomers, it could be through a development agreement, and that would come forward. If it is a DCC project, that's when we would deal with it as say developers paying for it, and we pay them back with DCC funds. So there's about 3 or 4 different scenarios, just depending on where the growth is attributable to, if it's in a DCC project or not. Have I answered your question?
Well, I guess, for instance, we've talked about the Southlands of Courtney having not enough sewer and water. And in this scenario, if we're willing to take that risk and do those infrastructure costs as a city, do we get them back through a DCC? Like that would be a DCC program piece, I would assume. So would we get those costs back in the long run?
Yeah, through the mayor to council fish. Yes, there would be, if the projects that are in there that are needed to support that growth were DCC projects, and when we front ended, we collected, and that would just go back into our financial piece.
Right, and projects like that, like this South Sewer project and such, well, maybe we won't call it that because there is another one called that, but there are other projects like that in growth areas, I would assume, that could be done if we wanted.
Yeah, and I think part of the things is, one of the things that we need to know more about is that we need to update our master plans with the capacity modeling with our growth so we can identify those better.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah.
All right, I don't see any further lights or questions, so maybe we can move on. All right, it's been moved in second. It is just for receipt, but I'll take a vote, and all those in favor. And motion carries. Excellent. Again, huge thanks. Very articulate things. I know we spent a lot of time on this tonight, but I think time worthwhile for sure. And again, just big kudos to staff and everybody involved to get us to this point, and we can sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel. So it's great. Really appreciate that. All right, we'll move into bylaws and we'll start with 3.1 municipal and regional district tax. Okay, it's been moved in second. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor, and the motion carried. Just a few votes in, it's not going to, but sorry. 3.2 snow and ice control reserve bylaw. All right, any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor, and motion carries. 3.3 solid waste reserve. All right, any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor, and motion carries. 3.4 police contingency reserve fund. All right, and Councillor, sorry, I have
Through the
Mr.
mayor,
Garbutt and then Councillor
through the mayor to council, we found we have a slight typo in the bylaw itself. And so it says shall and may. We're at adoption. The way the language reads, it defaults to may. And that's the intention of the bylaw. I just wanted to clarify that for council. There is time sensitivity related to the adoption of this bylaw. And so we propose, should council give that direction, we can proceed as is and address that typo at a later date. But council may have some other questions.
Sounds good. Thanks for that clarification. Councillor Jolicoeur.
Yeah, and thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the clarification on the typo in the bylaw. I guess so if we're looking under the amendment section D, section 10, all expenditures of money from the police contingency reserve shall occur when existing police budget has been exceeded or as authorized by council. And so I'm just wondering if staff can speak to whether or not this is kind of a standalone type of reserve with the city in terms of expenditures coming out of a reserve without authorization by council. I do note here that it says or as authorized by council, but I hadn't seen that language in other reserves. And so I guess my curiosity is just if and when the reserve needs to be drawn on for an unplanned police activity, just wanting clarity around, at what point does council get informed that funds are being drawn from the reserve, and what the practice or the process would be in informing council on that.
Mr. Garbutt.
Thanks. Through council, I'll let Mr. Langemeier talk about access to the money. I'll just start with the fact that these funds are utilized whereby we may have to fund investigations or activities of the police which are not optional. So at any point coming to council, it would be information, not for council authorizing that. We're setting this money aside for a specific reason, and it's not sort of like an option to not proceed when we have legal actions. But maybe Mr. Langemeier could speak to how he would intend to address the issue with council.
Langemeier.
Hello, nice to be here once again. So I'll start with right at the end of that sentence, or as authorized by council. I use that term to capture how council would typically authorize use through the financial planning process. So my intention here is if council wanted to use the police reserve bylaw to fund a single officer for the year instead of taxing for it, that would be where I would seek as directed by council. As the CEO mentioned, the more of those operational cost impacts is where staff have the ability to pay when we need to. Alternatively, if we're seeing a really big draw on this reserve, I would bring the options to council to say, hey, we've had this occurrence that is X amount of dollars. We can either use our our CMP surplus, replacing surplus, or we can use other funding sources. So we might not always have a healthy reserve in this, or healthy balance in this reserve. And so there might have to be other options taken.
Yeah, that's
Right,
very
thanks
helpful.
for the clarity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Jolicoeur. Police Contingency Reserve Fund on the table. All those in favor? And motion carries, and moving to election reserve bylaw. Excellent. And I don't see any questions or comments. It's great to see that we're going to be budgeting for this as a yearly amount rather than once every election. So really glad to see that smoothed out. And with that, all those in favor? And motion carries. And then Fire Protective Services. Any questions or comments? See none. All those in favor? And any opposed? I see none. And we'll move into development cost charges, 3164. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any questions or comments? Seeing none. All those in favor? And motion carries. And any questions or comments regarding the recommended motion? Councillor Jolicoeur.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Again, these estimates here are based on staff recommendation to bring us up to the maximum. Is that why these numbers, 325 and $1 million?
Mr. Lagermeyer.
That is correct. The figures before you bring the reserve balances up to the optimum balance as identified in the reserve establishment bylaws.
Thanks.
The police continue. Yeah.
Does that clarify, Councillor Jolicoeur?
Thank you. Yeah.
I think I got a thumbs up there. Okay, excellent. Motion's on the floor. All those in favor? And motion carries. And all right, we are adjourned. Thanks to cyberspace for allowing our colleague to have a very solid connection. Oh, Mr.
I just have a quick brief for council. That's not a matter on the agenda and it's not in camera, but I just want to.
We need to, why don't we stop streaming first?
Oh, I've lost you guys, I think.
Can you just give me a second to make sure I
Yeah.
got the stream off?
Absolutely. We're just going to